Hi, everyone, and welcome to our third quarter Outlook webinar for 2019 from Informa Pharma Intelligence. I am Dominique Fontanilla, Therapeutic Area Director for CNS and Immunology and Inflammation Diseases. And today I'm joined by Hardik Patel, Therapeutic Area Director of Oncology and Respiratory Diseases.
Hi, everyone.
Also, Michael Haydock, our Therapeutic Area Director for Infectious Diseases, as well as Cardiovascular and Metabolic Diseases.
Hi, everybody.
And also, we have Stephanie Yip, who is a Senior Analyst within CNS and I&I.
Hi, everyone.
So this webinar accompanies our Q3 2019 Outlook report from Biomedtracker, where we cover catalysts from 27 drugs, devices, and diagnostics expected to occur this quarter, in addition to a complete list of large impact catalysts through the end of this quarter. But today, Hardik, Michael, Stephanie, and I will take you through some of the important catalysts to expect this quarter in Q3. So first, Hardik will take you through Entrectinib for solid tumors and non-small cell lung cancer, followed by fedratinib in myelofibrosis. Then Michael will be going over highlights for inclisiran in dyslipidemia, as well as Omecamtiv mecarbil in CHF, before moving on to regimen in infectious disease. Stephanie will then feature a catalyst for Upadacitinib in rheumatoid arthritis. And then finally, I will finish up with two drugs in the CNS space, Lumateperone in schizophrenia and Arzira in multiple sclerosis. So without further delay, I will pass it on to Hardik to start us off in the oncology space.
Yeah, thanks, Dominique. As Dominique mentioned, the first catalyst I wanted to discuss is Entrectinib, which is a tyrosine kinase inhibitor, and it's almost two catalysts in one, as Roche has filed for its approval in both NTRK fusion-positive solid tumors as well as ROS1-positive non-small cell lung cancer. And the PDUFA date for this decision is August 18th, and based on the data available so far, it's highly likely that Roche will receive a positive decision from the FDA for both indications. Starting out, kind of looking at Entrectinib first in NTRK fusion-positive patients, the NDA was originally filed in December 2018, and this filing was based on a pooled analysis from 4 different early phase trials. And findings from these trials showed that NTRK fusion-positive patients treated with Entrectinib had a response rate of 57%, along with a median progression-free survival of 11.2 months and an overall survival of 20.9 months. And if we take a look at the current market for NTRK fusion-positive patients, the mutation is actually expressed in at least 25 different cancer types identified so far, and that includes lung cancer, breast cancer, pancreatic cancer, and various types of sarcoma. And so far, Eli Lilly's Vitraxvi is the only product approved for these patients. But based on initial data, it actually seems that Vitraxvi might be slightly more effective, as it's demonstrated response rates of around 80% in its early phase trials. But a key caveat to mention here is that the demographics of the data sets for these two drugs won't match exactly. And that also includes the proportion of patients in each trial with each cancer type. So it's kind of difficult to definitively say which is more effective at this point. As well, it's worth to mention that survival results for Vitraxvi have not been released yet. And those will probably be a little bit more telling of each drug's efficacy. But we can say, though, that it's likely that Vitraxvi has a better tolerability just due to its specificity against TRK mutations. So Entrectinib also targets ROS1 and ALK, which broadens its range of activity, but it also likely increases the rate of adverse events. But if we move on next to looking at Entrectinib in non-small cell lung cancer, the same group of studies that tested the drug in NTRK fusion-positive patients also included cohorts for non-small cell lung cancer patients with ROS1-positive disease. And the integrated data from these cohorts showed that the treatment with Entrectinib provided an impressive overall response rate of 77%, which was actually observed to be very durable with a median duration of response of almost 25 months. And looking at the market for ROS1-positive disease, ROS1 fusions actually occur in an estimated 1 to 2% of non-small cell lung cancer patients, which doesn't seem that high, but given the high incidence of non-small cell lung cancer, it's actually a decent amount in terms of a target population. And in regards to currently available treatments for these patients, Xalkori is really the only drug approved for this population. The NCCN guidelines do recommend off-label usage of products like Zycadia and Lorbrena in ROS1-positive patients, but it's likely that the kind of usage of these products will probably dissipate with the approval of additional options such as Entrectinib. And if we're looking at the efficacy in comparison to Xalkori, it's really kind of on par with each other, but a key factor that Roche will likely use to differentiate Entrectinib is its demonstrated CNS activity. We saw data from last year's World Conference on Lung Cancer, which showed that patients with CNS metastases at baseline who were treated with Entrectinib had a response rate of about 74%, which is close to the response rate in patients without CNS disease. And kind of this is mainly important to point out just because a lot of patients with stage 4 disease are kind of diagnosed with CNS metastases, but also because of the fact that about half of all ROS1 patients that are treated with Xalkori end up showing progression in the CNS due to Xalkori's poor brain penetration. So that means Entrectinib could potentially be positioned as a first-line therapy to either treat patients with CNS metastases or actually prevent CNS metastases in this patient population. And as you can see from the forecast clip to the right, the positioning in the first line could easily allow Entrectinib to generate over $100 million in annual sales by 2026, and that's just in the ROS1-positive non-small cell lung cancer population. So a significant commercial opportunity there. But before we move on to the next product, anybody have any questions on Entrectinib?
Hi, Hardik. I had a question actually on the NTRK segment specifically. Is there any way that you think Entrectinib is likely to be able to differentiate from Vitracfy, given that Vitracfy was approved earlier, and as you said, it seems to have a superior tolerability profile than Entrectinib?
Yeah, that's a good question. Obviously, the main difference is that Entrectinib has the potential to be used in ROS1-positive and maybe even ALK-positive patients due to its broader mechanism. But apart from that, I think these two drugs will kind of naturally differentiate from each other as the clinical experience with both of them grows. As I mentioned before, both drugs use pooled data from early phase studies for regulatory filings, so we don't have a kind of huge level of detail on these products. But we should soon see more survival and safety data, which will allow us for a better comparison, a little bit more differentiation. One thing I will note, though, is that there's an issue of acquired resistance with these products, which was discussed even before either of these drugs made it close to the NDA phase. I think if either one of these drugs is prone to acquiring specific forms of resistance, it could easily lead to preferential use of one over the other or specific guidance on sequencing these drugs in a particular order. And I think actually Eli Lilly and Loxo are a little bit ahead of the curve on this one, as they've already kind of started to develop a follow-on to Vitracfy to address resistance with a drug called LOXO-195. But regardless, I think the acquired resistance will be something to keep an eye on moving forward with these products.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on Entrectinib?
Hardik, would you say that the solid tumor market or the NSCLC market represents a greater opportunity for Entrectinib?
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison because if you look at it kind of on one hand, Entrectinib seems to be a bit more effective in ROS1 patients than in NTRK patients. But on the other hand, as I mentioned before, NTRK fusions have been detected in at least 25 different cancers. And while the occurrence of these mutations in common solid tumors like lung cancer and colorectal cancer is less than 1%, it does add up pretty quickly given the high incidence of these tumors. And then on top of that, there are a handful of kind of rare indications like secretory breast carcinoma and infantile fibrosarcoma, where the mutations are found in over probably 90% of patients. So I think just in terms of sheer target population, the NTRK fusion indication probably has more commercial potential. And looking at the competition, it's kind of similar in both indications. So I think overall, I'd probably say that the solid tumor market has a little bit more of an opportunity. Any other questions on Entrectinib before we move on? Take that as a no, and we can move on to the next product, which is fedratinib. Fedratinib is a JAK inhibitor, which has actually been in phase 3 development since way back in 2011, but it's finally nearing approval for myelofibrosis, and it has a target PDUFA date of September 3rd. Fedratinib was actually initially developed by a company called Targetgen, which was acquired by Sanofi, but as phase 3 trials, the results from phase 3 trials started to come in. It was actually reported that there were several cases of Wernicke's encephalopathy suspected in patients participating in the trials. And because of this, Sanofi halted all of its trials and essentially shelved the drug. After that point, one of the co-inventors of the drug actually formed a company called Impact Biomedicines and acquired rights, which occurred in 2016. This company, Impact, actually went on to conduct a retrospective review of the trial results, which ended up showing that 8 of the trial patients suspected to have Wernicke's encephalopathy. Of these patients, only 3 actually went on to have conclusive evidence to support a either likely or definite diagnosis of the disease. So the incidence of that kind of adverse event went down from there. And also looking at specifically the 3 patients that were determined to have a likely or definite diagnosis of Wernicke's encephalopathy, it was concluded that there were malnutrition issues that were caused by GI symptoms like nausea and vomiting that were either present before the trial started or were mismanaged during the trial, which was believed to be the cause of the encephalopathy rather than it being directly related to fedratinib treatment. So based on that, Impact was able to get the clinical hold lifted in October 2017, and then the company was actually acquired by Celgene in early 2018, who then proceeded to submit the NDA that we're looking at today. The NDA was based on the phase 3 Jakarta trial and the phase 2 Jakarta 2 trial, which together showed that about half of patients treated with fedratinib experienced spleen volume reductions of 35% or more, which is a fairly common endpoint used in myelofibrosis. And kind of looking at the myelofibrosis overall, right now, Jakafi, which was the first JAK inhibitor ever approved, is the only treatment available for intermediate or high-risk patients. And because of that, it leaves a pretty kind of significant opening for treatments for relapsed refractory patients. And this high level of unmet need increases fedratinib's chances of approval, of course, but it's kind of unclear at this point if this potential approval will be a broader approval for myelofibrosis in general, or if it will be limited to patients who have relapsed or are intolerant to Jakafi, which I personally think will be more likely the case. Obviously, there's a larger opportunity in the first-line setting, but I think this would probably require another trial testing fedratinib head-to-head with Jakafi, and I don't believe this sort of trial has been announced yet. Celgene did kick off the phase 3 Freedom trial, which aims to confirm fedratinib's safety and efficacy in Jakafi pretreated patients, and this trial may help kind of encourage further uptake if it is approved. But as I've seen so far, there haven't been any trials initiated that would enable first-line approval specifically. But that was mainly what I wanted to mention on fedratinib. Anyone have any questions on that?
Sure, I can jump in again. So you mentioned that fedratinib and Jakafi have similar mode of action. So what do you think the clinical rationale is for using fedratinib in Jakafi-resistant patients? And does the company have any existing clinical trial data to support use in that group?
Yeah. Thanks for pointing that out, Michael. I should actually highlight that the phase 2 Jakarta-2 trial specifically enrolled patients who had previously been treated with Jakafi, whereas the phase 3 Jakarta trial excluded patients who had received any JAK2 inhibitor prior to the trial. So the phase 2 trial does provide evidence for fedratinib's use in Jakafi-resistant patients. As far as why fedratinib is effective in these patients who have progressed, fedratinib is effective in Jakafi progressing patients. The reasoning isn't fully known, but it likely has to do with the fact that the two drugs have slightly different mechanisms. Jakafi inhibits JAK1 and JAK2 to a similar degree, whereas fedratinib is more specific to JAK2, and it also has some inhibitory effects on targets like FLT3. Based on that, it's believed that fedratinib can overcome some of the mechanisms of resistance to Jakafi, things like the M929I gatekeeper mutation. So there's pretty good rationale there for its use in the second line. Any other questions on fedratinib before we move on?
What would you say on fedratinib's profile so far, beyond the kind of revival story with respect to the Wernicke's encephalopathy side of things?
Yeah, so I think because of the slightly different mechanisms I just mentioned, fedratinib does have somewhat of a different tolerability profile than Jakafi. I think its inhibitory effects on FLT3 cause it to have more gastrointestinal side effects like diarrhea and nausea and vomiting. But apart from that, though, I think the side effects observed for fedratinib are in line with other JAK inhibitors. You have the increased rate of hematological side effects like anemia and thrombocytopenia and neutropenia, as well as an increased risk of infections. So overall, not the best tolerability profile for fedratinib, but considering the lack of options for patients with myelofibrosis, I would say that the benefits likely outweigh the downsides in most patients. And I think the kind of risk-benefit ratio will likely continue to improve as physicians learn how to best manage the side effects of the drug. If there are no further questions, I will pass it on to Michael to discuss a few more drugs.
Thanks, Hardik, and hello again, everybody. I'm going to talk through a couple of key events coming up in the cardiovascular and metabolic space, and then I'll end with one in the infectious disease space. But firstly, let's start with inclisiran, which is a small interfering RNA, apologies, went one slide too far, small interfering RNA that suppresses PCSK9 production. It's been developed by the medicines company and Alnylam for the treatment of dyslipidemia. So the main catalysts we're expecting are top-line data from Orion 10 and Orion 11, which are the drug's pivotal trials. But first, to give you a little bit of context on the market, Repatha and Praluent are the currently established PCSK9 inhibitors on the market, and they've shown substantial additional LDL-C reductions in patients who are already receiving maximally tolerated statins, which is the cheaper generic standard of care for dyslipidemia. In addition to that, they've also shown reasonably moderate but considered clinically significant and also statistically significant reductions in major adverse cardiovascular events, so approximately 15% in their cardiovascular outcome studies. And even though they initially had quite disappointing uptake and sales trajectories because of concerns over cost effectiveness and the resulting prior authorization criteria that were quite stringent that were introduced, both companies in 2018 actually offered very substantial discounts for those products. I think it was about 60% or so off the list prices. And as a result, they're now experiencing significant volume growth. So inclisiran is set to enter the market as a third-to-market PCSK9 agent, and the companies are hoping that they'll be able to differentiate based on inclisiran's more attractive dosing schedule. So inclisiran is given at subcutaneous day 0, day 90, and then every 6 months from then on, whereas Praluent and Repatha are given every 2 or 4 months, and are also injectables. So it has a superior dosing schedule, which are hoping to differentiate, but obviously it will rely greatly on the Orion 10 and Orion 11 pivotal data. So those are the pivotal trials in patients with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, as well as elevated LDL-C, or low-density lipoprotein cholesterol. They're hoping that it will show at least comparable reductions to Praluent and Repatha in terms of LDL-C, and also a safe, or at least an attractive safety profile. You can see our likelihood of approval estimate is 10% above average, and that's because we believe the phase 3 program's already been quite significantly de-risked by the fact that there's a very positive phase 2 data from the Orion 3 study. So that showed a mean 51% additional reduction on top of the maximally tolerated statins at 22 months, which is in the same order of magnitude to Repatha. It's quite hard to determine very precise comparisons, because of the trial designs differ slightly and the baseline characteristics differ, but also because of the time measurements that are used are slightly different within the trials. But it seems very positive, and it has a good safety profile so far. They have data for approximately 3 years. So moving on to our forecast, as I mentioned, despite it entering the market quite late, we are expecting gradually over time inclisiran to emerge as the most prescribed PCSK9 inhibitor. So by the end of the forecast period here for the US, Japan, and the 5 EU markets, we're expecting inclisiran to have captured approximately 36% market share. Now, driven largely by its superior dosing schedule. Another really important catalyst, which is quite far in the future but will also be important to inclisiran's uptake, is the cardiovascular outcomes trial. So as I mentioned, Praluent and Repatha already have their cardiovascular outcome data where they showed, as I say, moderate but clinically significant reductions in MACE. If inclisiran is able to show at least comparable reductions in the high-risk patients that they're enrolling, then that will be significant. We expect that will boost sales as well, because that will probably be one of the main disadvantages that at the time it reaches the market, although it will have the LDL-C reduction data, which is the soft endpoint. What payers and physicians and patients care about most is actually, does it reduce hard real-world endpoints on cardiovascular disease. So that will be a significant driver of uptake there. If the data, we expect it could be added to the label in 2026, but the top-line data may well be available earlier from that Orion 4 study. So that's all I had to say about inclisiran today. Are there any questions?
I have a question, Michael. Do you think that its late market entry as the third PCSK9 targeting agent will put it at a significant disadvantage, or do you think it's going to be able to compete by undercutting the marketed therapies in terms of price?
Yes, I think price will definitely be very important. So the dosing schedule, as I mentioned, is obviously a quite significant advantage, because it could lead to better real-world compliance. Whether that would lead to better outcomes isn't clear yet, but that's one potential advantage. But certainly, in the first couple of years on the market, I think we are expecting it to launch at a slight discount to Praluent and Repatha, and that's largely because of the large impact that the PCSK9 inhibitors, as they grow in volume, are expected to have on payer budgets, because dyslipidemia is a very prevalent disease, particularly in the US. We expect that cost is likely to be the primary determinant of prescribing trends, and if inclisiran is to achieve favourable formulary status, ideally preferentially reimbursed or exclusively reimbursed, then they'll likely have to offer discounts to payers to get onto those formularies. So I think primarily it will be done by price, with dosing schedule helping that, and then probably in the long term, as I said, the CVOT data will become very important for comparisons there. Any other questions at all?
Yeah, Michael, you mentioned the other PCSK9 inhibitors that inclisiran will eventually be kind of compared to, but are there actually any head-to-head studies that are going on with one or both of these drugs?
Yeah, that's a good question. In terms of pivotal trials, there aren't any head-to-head comparisons with Repatha or Praluent, at least not yet. They might maybe do that as a post-approval. For approval, I think they're just looking to show by indirect comparison at least roughly comparable efficacy. They do, however, have in their Orion 3 study, which is a phase 2 study that's currently ongoing, they did include an arm that I think was around 90 patients or so that is being treated with Repatha, and they're going to obviously compare that to their own drug. So they will have some soft comparisons from a relatively small study that might help assuage any concerns that there might be a difference in efficacy, but no, at the moment there isn't any direct head-to-head, and as I say, that's probably because in reality it's going to be the CVOT data and also the price that are going to be the main differentiators. So even if they were, let's say, to do a head-to-head study and they did show a marginal benefit in LDL-C reduction with inclisiran, that may not actually be enough to really alter prescribing trends anyway until the CVOT data are out. So it's probably, I would assume they've maybe assumed that it's just an unnecessary risk given the expense of such a trial.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so in the interest of time, I will move on to my next catalyst, which is a novel heart failure drug called Omecamtiv mecarbil. It's a very interesting drug in that it's an inotrope, which I'll go into a bit more. It's a direct myosin ATPase stimulator, which effectively means it has a direct impact on the cardiac function. So it stimulates myocytes to contract. And it's being developed for the treatment of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. So we're expecting top-line data to be released from the ongoing pivotal galactic heart failure study, which is investigating Omecamtiv as an add-on to current standard of care agents such as ACE inhibitors, for example. And again, that's in reduced ejection fraction patients. The primary endpoint is the time to cardiovascular death or first heart failure event. So it's a composite endpoint. That's pretty standard primary endpoint for chronic heart failure. And you can see once again our likelihood of approval estimate is positive, and that's based on the preliminary but overall positive data from the COSMIC-HS study, in which Omecamtiv displayed reasonably small but consistent improvements in all measures of cardiac function. And so that was a very good proof of concept of efficacy. So as I've listed some examples there of what they improved. So increase in stroke volume, which is effectively the volume of blood that's ejected from the left ventricle, reduction in end ventricular volume, and also reduction in NT-proBNP, which is a biomarker for heart failure and strain on the heart. So all of those are actually good predictors of improvements in hard outcomes like reduction in heart failure, for example. So they were quite promising data. There is still a slight safety concern that definitely needs to be addressed in the phase 3 studies, that there were small troponin increases in the Omecamtiv arm versus placebo in that COSMIC-HS study. And that's a potentially concerning safety signal because troponin is a marker of cardiac ischemia. So that's certainly something that will be scrutinized. Somewhat reassuringly, none of the troponin increases in that particular study were deemed to be associated with ischemia, but the trial was reasonably small. It's about 450 patients or so, which for heart failure is obviously much smaller than you would do for a phase 3 trial. And it was the data that they've released so far for only 20 weeks of dosing, so it's possible that the trial was too limited to detect any adverse ischemia events, but it's certainly something to watch. In terms of the Omecamtiv's role in the future market. So to give it a little bit of context, current CHF therapies act by relieving symptoms and also trying to reduce the burden on the heart, but they don't address the underlying dysfunction in reduced ejection fraction, which is effectively that the left ventricle isn't pumping sufficient blood. So there's a huge amount of unmet need for therapies like Omecamtiv that could potentially do that. So there are some currently available inotropes, but they are very rarely used at the moment due to safety concerns. So they've been shown to increase intracellular calcium levels, and that's toxic, and increase oxygen demand. And they've also been linked to increased risk of arrhythmias and death. So because of that, they've fallen out of favour. But Omecamtiv, because of its direct action on myosin ATPase, it could bypass those safety concerns, which would mean it would be quite attractive in reduced ejection fraction. I guess the downside of its mode of action means that it's not really relevant for preserved ejection fraction, which is about 50% of patients. But for the reduced ejection fraction segment, at least, it seems pretty promising from the phase 2 data, barring that safety concern. So, and that's been reflected in our key opinion leader interviews that we performed. So I won't read through these in detail, but just to summarise effectively, the sentiment is that as long as it is proven to be safe, particularly with those troponin increases I mentioned, it's a potentially very attractive mechanism of action because it doesn't have other impacts on things like heart rate, blood pressure, potassium levels, etc., that other drugs do that can sometimes limit their use. So that's a very positive plus to have there. So it's all to play for when it comes to the phase 3 data. But clearly the key opinion leaders were very optimistic because there's quite a huge need for extra drugs in reduced ejection fraction. I will leave it there for Omecamtiv. Any questions at all?
Yeah, so how do you foresee Omecamtiv fitting into the treatment algorithm for CHF?
Yeah, well, I think certainly initially it will be added on to ACE inhibitors, angiotensin receptor blockers, beta blockers. So they're currently standardized, widely genericized standard of care. That's how it's being investigated at the moment. And as you can see on the one of the bottom key opinion leader quote there, you can see one of its pluses, as mentioned, is that it doesn't disrupt other aspects like heart rate, blood pressure, etc. So that's very positive because it means that it could really be positioned anywhere within reduced ejection heart failure. Another point I would make, although I don't think it will happen immediately for two main reasons. It could potentially be used in future as an add-on to Entresto. So Entresto is a blockbuster drug at the moment that launched a few years ago and has got significant uptake in reduced ejection fraction because it was also able to show a significant reduction in hospitalization due to heart failure and death due to heart failure as well in its pivotal trials. And it's increasingly seeing uptake in reduced ejection fraction in class 2 and class 3 who are reasonably severe heart failure patients. So if Omecamtiv's study does show that it also reduces heart failure, hospitalization and death, then there's a bit of an interesting rationale for what happens if you use both together. As I say, there's no data for that at the moment, and it's possible that future studies will investigate that. But one of probably the main limiter of that sort of strategy would be cost, because Entresto is already significantly more expensive than generics. And so if you add in two branded drugs, then that might become prohibitive, especially for Medicare patients, for example, who might fall into the donut hole in the US just based on those extra costs. But the short answer is really anywhere within a reduced ejection fraction, but certainly on top of generics rather than replacing them. Any other questions at all?
Yeah, following on what you just kind of mentioned about the cost and potential combination approaches, and kind of given the fact that Omecamtiv has a unique mechanism, its price can kind of really fall within a pretty large range. But do you have any initial thoughts on what the potential pricing for Omecamtiv might be?
Yeah, so in our current forecast, we've assumed a cost along the same lines of Entresto, because Entresto is a good analog as a branded drug going into a widely genericized market with a benefit in heart failure, hospitalization, and death. I think it showed about 18% reduction relative to the placebo-treated patients in its pivotal trial. So it's a nice analog. So we've assumed a similar price to Entresto, which I believe discounted prices in the US somewhere around $3,500 per patient per year, which is obviously relatively small compared to other areas, but when you factor in that the heart failure population is pretty large, that's why. Obviously, the exact price will be determined by the extent of the benefit it provides on those hard endpoints that I mentioned before. But for now, we've assumed something in line for Entresto. And again, as I mentioned, the Medicare patients, if there ever was going to be additional use of maybe a generic ACE inhibitor plus Entresto plus Omecamtiv, then obviously the pricing strategy might change there a little bit because, as I mentioned, the Medicare population, which obviously heart failure is focused generally in the elderly population, that the costs might become prohibitive for that population there.
Okay, thank you.
Great, and I will move on to my last catalyst, which I mentioned, changing tack completely into the infectious disease space. Talking about a drug here called Datamonitor, anti-tuberculosis agent being developed by the Tuberculosis Alliance in partnership with Mylan. And this drug is particularly interesting. Many people in Western markets might not really see tuberculosis as that large an issue, or might not think of it as that large an issue, but it's a drug being developed in combination with bedaquiline and linazolid, which is what the PA is, Datamonitor, so you've got the BL-PA regimen there. It's being developed for multi-drug resistant and extensively drug-resistant tuberculosis, and the World Health Organization estimates there's approximately 10 million incident cases of TB globally. Roughly 460,000 of those are classed as multi-drug resistant, which means the bacteria is resistant to rifampicin, and the second drug, isoniazid. So it's resistant to those two, and then extensively drug resistant is resistant to both of those plus at least another two agents. And you can see of those MDR cases, about 8.5% are XDR. So it is still a significant problem, just not generally focused in the Western markets as much. And the issue really with current treatment is that two things really, tolerability and also quite extensive treatment durations. So because of the bacteria's resistance to multiple first-line drugs by the time this new regimen would be used, current World Health Organization guidelines recommend effectively that patients should receive at least 18 to 20 months of treatment, if not longer, depending on their response to the treatment. And also they have to use at least 4 drugs, again, sometimes more depending on the resistance profile of the bacteria. And it so happens that those drugs are pretty poorly tolerated, so combined with the extensive treatment duration, that leads to generally poor compliance. And that in itself leads to, not only because the bacteria are resistant, but also because patients are not often fully compliant to treatment, that leads to suboptimal outcomes. So there is still huge need. In terms of what we're expecting this quarter, expecting an FDA approval decision in either August or September on the back of a positive AdCom meeting that happened last month. As I say, it will be approved. If it is approved, it will be approved only as part of this BL-PA regimen. You can see we have a very high likelihood of approval, it's about 94%, and that's following the AdCom meeting where the panelists voted 14-4 to recommend the drug's approval. And while the panel did note concerns over the small sample size of the trial, the submission was based on a single trial called NIX-TB in multi-drug resistant and extensively drug resistant TB patients, and only 45 patients were available at the time of the NDA submission, so it's a very small sample to approve a drug on. And there was also no control arm. The study was controlled using a historical control comparison. So that makes it impossible to discern Datamonitor's efficacy and safety contribution to that regimen, but the majority of panelists are still swayed by the very high durable cure rates that were observed, close to 90%, which is much, much higher than the historical control, which is already quite conservative, and that was 50%. So I think the efficacy swayed the panel. As such, we do expect that the FDA will approve the drug, and the additional safety and efficacy data, because there are some lingering safety concerns, particularly around hepatotoxicity and fertility toxicity as well, could be added to the label post-approval. So we do expect it to gain approval, but certainly in the short term, until those safety issues are ironed out, when those studies are completed, that will certainly be a limiter of uptake. And then finally, cost as well. Even though it's developed by the TB Alliance, it's being used in combination with bedaquiline, and that has already had issues with regards to market access. Johnson & Johnson actually had to donate that drug for the last few years given market access issues, and the donation program actually ended at the end of Q1, so cost will certainly be an issue. Any questions at all?
Yeah, Michael, just curious about the FDA AdCom meeting. Was the kind of main point of discussion and concern mainly about the single arm, the lack of a control arm rather in the trial, or was it more so about the safety issues that have yet to be sorted out?
I think most of the concern was probably on the safety issues. As I say, there are only 45 patients, and hepatotoxicity and fertility toxicity could obviously be quite severe if this wasn't picked up and the drug was widely used before the additional analyses are complete. So the company is actually doing ongoing studies that I believe are expected to complete by the end of this year. So in reality, the drug wouldn't really have much of a window for use between now and then anyway. However, you're right, they did. I think generally the panel were quite accepting of the lack of a control arm, given the population. There isn't really a well-defined regimen that can be used in extensively drug-resistant, because it just depends on the resistance profile. And also, given the large efficacy difference between the historical control arm, I think they were generally willing to accept that it was a very active regimen. I would say the control arm, I mentioned, it was very conservative. They had a rate of 50% was what they decided to compare their regimen against. The study was actually conducted in South Africa exclusively, and if you look at the historical literature rates for South Africa, the success rates were only around 15 to 20% or so. So it really was a very conservative comparison. But to answer your question, I think really it was the safety was probably what swayed the 4 panelists to vote against it. I'm wary of time, so I will pass over to Stephanie next to talk about a rheumatoid arthritis drug.
Well, thank you, Michael. Let me just change slides. I'm going to be talking about AbbVie's Upadacitinib, and that is its Janus Kinase 1 inhibitor, which is also known as a JAK inhibitor. It's currently under priority review by the FDA for moderate to severe RA, with a target action date in August. It's been tested in its so-called SELECT program, which is its clinical trial program for rheumatoid arthritis. It satisfied all primary and secondary endpoints across its 5 pivotal trials, including the widely recognized ACR endpoints, clinical remission, etc. So there's been some nice consistency supporting efficacy there, and that's across multiple lines of therapy, from first-line methotrexate naive patients to inadequate responders to biologic disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs, which include the anti-tumor necrosis factor inhibitors, the first port of call in terms of biologics. Humira is an example of one. Whether Upadacitinib would be used across all lines of therapy is a bit of a different matter. From talking to key opinion leaders lately, there's a positive outlook on its approval. There aren't any events that are expected to hamper approval. It's July now, and there's not been an FDA advisory committee meeting announced, so the path's looking smooth. We have its likelihood of approval at 11% above average, so high hopes here. It does look effective for rheumatoid arthritis and promising as a next-generation oral JAK inhibitor. There are actually 2 other oral JAK inhibitors available for rheumatoid arthritis. So there's Pfizer's Xeljanz, which contains tofacitinib, and Eli Lilly's Olumiant, baricitinib. This class is distinct from most biologic therapies for rheumatoid arthritis that tend to be available in subcutaneous or intravenous formulations. So JAK inhibitors offer the advantage of convenience, and physicians do have some experience with this class already and the mechanism of action. Basically, AbbVie is looking to jump on the bandwagon in developing Upadacitinib with the intent to protect its market share in RA, since its other drug Humira will be facing more and more biosimilar competition in the future. Humira accounted for about 61% of AbbVie's total net revenues in 2018, so it's the company's crown jewel, really. It already lost exclusivity in the EU back in October, and it won't be too long before the US patent cliff in a few years, with biosimilars expected in 2023 in the US. So yeah, AbbVie will be trying to launch upadacitinib as soon as possible in anticipation of this. Does anyone have any questions on this?
Hi, Stephanie. How do you think it compares clinically to the other JAK inhibitors? Because I know Xeljanz and Olumiant are already on the market. So are there any differentiating factors that you spotted so far in the data?
Well, of course, it's quite difficult to compare between trials considering their differences in design and setting, etc. From discussions with key opinion leaders, they would have liked to see AbbVie being bold with head-to-head studies between upadacitinib and the marketed JAK inhibitors you mentioned, but we don't have any data like that. Unfortunately, they've all produced head-to-head data with Humira, so that's the gold standard biologic for rheumatoid arthritis. Numerically speaking, the magnitude of separation between Humira was greatest with upadacitinib on the ACR50 endpoint. So that was a 16% difference compared to Olumiant's 6 to 10% and Xeljanz's 7% in pivotal trials. That was in inadequate responders to methotrexate. Also, at EULAR, the European League Against Rheumatism conference this year, more clinical remission data were presented from upadacitinib Select Early and Select Compare trials. A significantly higher proportion of patients receiving upadacitinib monotherapy or upadacitinib in combination regimen with methotrexate stayed in clinical remission compared to those who are just on methotrexate or on methotrexate and Humira, so that's positive. Clinical remission is a key treatment goal in rheumatoid arthritis, and I think upadacitinib monotherapy, and I think it's shown good data with superiority over gold standard drug. So AbbVie is definitely going to emphasize that to help position it as a follow-on product from Humira. In terms of safety, there's been a bit of a cloud of cardiovascular issues hanging over the JAK inhibitors. So in the US, Olumiant was only approved at the lower 2 milligram dose after the FDA advisory panel voted against the safety of the higher 4 milligram dose due to a high rate of serious venous thromboembolic events. There's actually an ongoing open-label safety study to assess the risk of cardiovascular events with Xeljanz versus the anti-tumor necrosis factor inhibitors, the anti-TNFs. And the Data Safety Monitoring Board has noted a statistically significant difference in pulmonary embolism events in the 10 milligram twice daily Xeljanz arm versus the anti-TNF arm. And that higher dose has also been associated with an increase in overall mortality versus the lower 5 milligram twice daily dose and the anti-TNF arm. On balance, the 5 milligram twice daily dose is still considered to have a balanced benefit-risk profile, and that's the dose that's approved for RA. So the results shouldn't have a totally detrimental effect on its uptake in this indication. With upadacitinib, that was also associated with venous thromboembolic events, but the rates were consistent with the background rate for rheumatoid arthritis patients. And these CV issues aren't necessarily a class-wide issue. If you look at filgotinib, that's also in the pipeline. It's got clean data, but still, speaking with a KOL in the UK, they mentioned that there will be scrutiny from data from the ongoing safety study. With all that being said, even though we can't definitively say one JAK inhibitor is better than the other without head-to-head trials, I think upadacitinib does have strong broad data of different therapies in RA, and a US KOL actually said that its demonstration of superiority to Humira at every time point and measure was compelling enough to consider it as one of the most effective drugs for rheumatoid arthritis. If anything were to compromise its clinical attractiveness, it will potentially be the bad safety rep that's been associated with the higher doses of other drugs in the class.
Perfect, thank you.
Cool. Any other questions?
Yeah, I guess where do you think that JAK inhibitors are going to primarily be used in the future, like after the TNFs or before or even both?
That's a good question. I think pricing is central to the answer. So in RA, cost is the primary determinant of market access and which line of therapy the drugs sit at in the treatment algorithm. So if it's cheaper, then it's going to be prioritized. And since Upadacitinib is likely to come in at a higher branded price like the other JAK inhibitors, it's probably going to be relegated to the later lines of therapy, as we've seen with the current treatment landscape, with greater use of the JAK inhibitors at third line and beyond. So at first line, conventional synthetic DMARDs are used, and it's standard for patients to receive cheap generic methotrexate, hydroxychloroquine, sulfasalazine, etc. first. And then at second line, that's where the biologic DMARDs come in, with the anti-TNFs used most commonly, and those have substantial price discounts and are favored by the payers. So the main position for the JAK inhibitors would be as second-line biologics after TNF failure, but things might look up later on as the class increases market penetration over time. There might be steepened discounts and volume rebates that could facilitate prioritization given the oral convenience advantage. There's also potential for them to have a better position in the EU treatment algorithm. So in the EULAR treatment guidelines, there's parity between the JAK inhibitors and anti-TNFs. So they could compete with at second line there. But I guess the tricky part would be competing with the biosimilars of the anti-TNFs. And at the moment, there's adalimumab, etanercept, and infliximab biosimilars available. I think the bottom line is that the JAK inhibitors will mainly be used after TNFs unless they offer a lower price of either the pipeline drugs undercutting marketed therapies or greater discounts for the marketed ones as they gain volume over time. Otherwise, the general sentiment is that available RA therapies are pretty similar clinically on the whole, and without the same discounts as anti-TNFs and biosimilars, using the JAK inhibitors in early lines of therapy won't be justified in most cases. It's probably going to be important for companies to try and pad out the number of approved I&I indications in the labeling of their JAK inhibitors, because those broader labels will help towards earlier positioning through greater volume discounts. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, Dominique, you can take it away.
All right, thanks, Stephanie. So I will start off by speaking about Lumateperone, which is in development from a company called Intracellular Therapies, and they have yet to get a marketed drug. All of their assets are currently in the pipeline. Lumateperone is an orally available drug, and it has a pretty complicated mechanism of action. It provides selective and simultaneous modulation of serotonin, dopamine, and glutamate, which is the unique differentiator here, the glutamate part. It's a dopamine receptor phosphoprotein modulator, and it acts as a presynaptic partial agonist and postsynaptic antagonist at D2 receptors. So this is a very big quarter for Intracellular Therapies because, as I mentioned, this company doesn't have any approved drug yet. And Lumateperone is their lead compound, which currently has a target PDUFA date of September 27th for schizophrenia. In addition, there's a planned FDA advisory meeting on July 31st to look forward to. Our Biomedtracker likelihood of approval is 81%, which is actually 4% below average for drugs at the application stage in this indication. And that's because the drug has had very mixed results so far in its pivotal trials. So there's a lot of uncertainty going on into the FDA AdCom meeting as well as the PDUFA. So just to give some background, in 2016, to everybody's surprise, Lumateperone failed its second phase 3 study, the 302 trial, and neither of the doses tested, 20 milligrams and 60 milligrams, separated from placebo on the primary endpoint measure of change from baseline on the positive and negative syndrome scale, or also known as PANSS, total score. So even more disappointing was that the active comparator, risperidone, did separate from placebo in that trial. And even though at the time the company blamed the failure in part on an unusually high placebo response, which does tend to happen quite a lot. But again, this didn't seem to affect the clear separation that was seen with risperidone, the comparator. So that data was quite disappointing. However, Lumateperone's clinical trial program also included 2 positive studies, albeit with modestly positive, which include a phase 3 trial that reported in 2015, the 301 study, and that showed a mean decline of 14.5 on the PANSS at week 4 using the 60 milligram dose, compared with a drop of 10.3 for placebo. Also, in a previous phase 2 trial, the 005 study, the efficacy of 60 milligram lumateperone and risperidone were similar. So it's coming in with 2 positive trials and 1 negative one. So despite the drug's modest efficacy that we've seen so far, lumateperone's potential differentiating factor really is its favorable safety and tolerability profile, which in trials was almost similar to placebo. And it was significantly better than risperidone's on safety. And this is quite important because even though the schizophrenia market is increasingly becoming quite crowded, there continues to be a high unmet need for therapies that improve upon tolerability and safety profiles of the current assets on the market. So going back to the actual catalyst, given the uncertainty here, we aren't 100% sure what to expect on September 27th. The FDA so far has given positive feedback regarding the 2 positive trials, but we will have a clear idea at the AdCom meeting later this month. While lumateperone does boast a favorable tolerability profile, as I mentioned, this might be insufficient to significantly differentiate it from other atypical antipsychotics in the crowded market and to justify its anticipated price premium for being a potential first-in-class drug. And then another issue that we're seeing is that the drug is being studied in acutely exacerbated patients and not for maintenance treatment, where you would presume an improved tolerability profile would be most beneficial. So would regulators approve a drug that has moderate efficacy, even though it has a great safety profile, especially since there are other options available with superior efficacy, such as drugs like Abilify and Latuda? It's really unclear at the moment. So it's unclear if the FDA will accept the 2 successful drugs for approval, and so this will be one to follow in the next coming months. And actually, this has been somewhat of a trend now with lumateperone. Top-line results came out this week on Monday, actually, for 2 phase 3 trials testing the drug in bipolar depression this time. And again, they were similarly mixed results, with one trial meeting its primary endpoint for improvement in depressive episodes. But then in the second monotherapy trial, it didn't separate from placebo, which is a shame. But it's prompted intracellular therapies to meet with the FDA and really try to make better sense of the data to have a clearer path forward. But yeah, this is definitely one to watch to see what will happen. We've spoken to some KOLs, and they think that it should be approved and it basically will become another tool in their toolbox. But who knows what the FDA will say. So I guess before I move on, in the interest of time here, I think I have time for one question. Does anyone have a question on lumateperone?
Sure, I can jump in. Is there any indirect generic competition that you think the drug will face in the schizophrenia market, or do you think it will largely bypass that by the fact that, as you say, might well be reserved for the refractory patients as another tool when it's needed?
So I don't think this has a really straightforward answer, just because the treatment algorithm in schizophrenia is mostly targeted to the individual patient and the specific symptoms that they have, so it can vary from patient to patient. But if we look at our primary research, actually, it's indicated that even in the second line or beyond settings where the refractory patients presumably sit in both acute and stable schizophrenia, we see that the well-established and more mature oral atypical antipsychotics, which have generics on the market, are the most prescribed. And this includes generics of Abilify, Seroquel, and Zyprexa. So it certainly, I think it seems that Lumateperone will face competition if it's approved to generics. There are a lot of barriers to uptake for all these newer schizophrenia drugs. I think in the interest of time, I will move on to my last catalyst. I wanted to discuss the subcutaneous formulation of Arzira, or ofatumumab, from Novartis. It's a fully human, high-affinity antibody that targets a novel epitope on cluster of differentiation 20, or CD20, on the B-cell membrane, which was first approved in oncology for the treatment of chronic lymphocytic leukemia, or CLL, in the U.S. in 2009. But actually, it hasn't gained a great deal of uptake there mainly due to competition with Rituxan. So while Arzira for CLL is an IV formulated drug, Novartis and Genmab developed a subcutaneous version of ofatumumab for multiple sclerosis, and we are expecting top-line results from the 2 phase 3 trials named Asclepios 1 and 2 this quarter. So far, it's looking promising for Arzira in this new indication with a Biomedtracker LOA of 54%, which is 2% above average. And this is kind of a resurrection for the drug on Novartis's part because, as I mentioned, it hasn't gained a lot of uptake in CLL. And actually, last year, the company even decided to stop marketing Arzira outside the U.S. for CLL due to low usage. So far in multiple sclerosis, we have only seen data from Arzira's phase 2 MIRROR trial, which are very promising. The trial enrolled 232 patients with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, and the cumulative number of new lesions was reduced by 65% for all of the dose groups versus placebo, and this was after 4 months of treatment. And then further, there was even a greater than or equal to 90% lesion reduction versus placebo after 12 weeks with the higher doses of ofatumumab. The first readouts from the phase 3 trials are going to be very interesting because they are head-to-head against Sanofi's Aubagio, and even though future potential market competition will most likely come from the other CD20-directed antibody in MS, Ocrevus, it will be interesting to see how it compares against this active comparator. I just wanted to put this into context. This will potentially be Novartis's third offering in the MS market after Gilenya and Mayzent. Gilenya, which was the first sphingosine 1-phosphate modulator to be approved for MS in 2010, targets relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, which is the most common form of the disease. And so far, it's been a blockbuster drug for Novartis, bringing in more than $3 billion in sales last year. And so I think Novartis is attempting to bolster its MS portfolio, especially since Gilenya will be facing really aggressive generic erosion in Europe. In the U.S., the USPTO upheld a dose patent last year for Gilenya, which in theory extends the drug's exclusivity until 2027. But depending on the outcomes of all these legal disputes, the patent cliff could enter the U.S. as soon as 2022. And then Mayzent, which I spoke about in our first quarter Outlook webinar, was just approved in March of this year, and its approval was a bit surprising. It was broader than expected. So it includes secondary progressive MS, clinically isolated syndrome, and also relapsing remitting MS. Although Novartis has said that their focus for Mayzent in the next year will be on the secondary progressive MS patient population. So I think everything looks very promising so far for Arzira's potential second running in an indication outside of CLL, and we're looking forward to these phase 3 results. And considering how well Ocrevus has done in this space, I think Arzira has a lot of commercial potential potential as well if the data continues to hold. I will take one question, I guess. Does anyone have any questions on Arzira in MS?
I have a question, Dominique. So what would you say are the resistors that Arzira will face in reaching the market and competing successfully considering the current climate?
Yeah, so even if the data look promising so far, I guess it's never as rosy as it seems. I think Arzira will likely face a lot of competition within the relapsing MS setting, which is really saturated right now with disease-modifying therapies. And so competition will be pretty tough unless these phase 3 results will demonstrate something radical on Arzira's part. I think the thinking on Novartis's part was that the success seen with Roche's Ocrevus will potentially spill over to Arzira if all goes well, but there again, you have additional competition from a highly successful blockbuster drug and that physicians are already familiar with as it reached the market first. Interestingly, I think Ocrevus was also approved for primary progressive MS, which is currently an area of high unmet need. But I haven't actually seen anything indicating that Novartis is pursuing development in progressive MS. And so it's unlikely that Arzira will benefit from that added uptake in progressive disease. Some have touted Arzira's subcutaneous formulation to be a benefit of convenience as compared to Ocrevus's IV administration. But I think it may actually be a potential barrier depending on how this plays out because Ocrevus's dosing schedule is a 4-hour IV infusion every 6 months, while Arzira is administered as a monthly subcutaneous injection, which doesn't seem to have that much benefit over an infusion every 6 months. And then in addition to this, I think some physicians have been worrying that patients will fail to comply as well with a subcutaneous injection as they would with an in-hospital IV infusion. So that's another potential resistor there. Pricing will also be another potential resistor. Ocrevus was priced at an annual list price of $65,000, which is around 25% lower than the other MS drugs. And so Novartis will have to price subcutaneous Arzira similarly or lower in order to compete. But I really haven't seen any information so far as to their pricing strategy and whether it will be priced differently than the IV formulation used in oncology. But dosing for the subcutaneous version in MS is much lower than that one used in onco. So at least the annual price will differ there. Also, I guess, in terms of pricing, the oral generic of Gilenya will be introduced, as I mentioned, potentially as soon as 2022. So that may also contribute to pricing competition with Arzira. So there are definitely some barriers to uptake if Arzira reaches the MS market. But I think if these phase 3 results are positive, the outlook for the drug is still relatively optimistic. I think that's all the time we have for questions now because we're running off over time. I just wanted to thank everybody for listening to Informa Pharma Intelligence's 2019 third quarter Outlook webinar. As a reminder, if you submitted questions through this webcast, we will be collecting and answering them by email. Alternatively, you can also submit questions after the webinar at the email address shown on the screen, which is pharma@informa.com, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Thanks again, everyone.